Hello, my name is Boon Hui Tan from the Institutum in Singapore and Executive Director of the Arts House Limited. Today we're here to speak with contemporary artist Robert Zhao. Robert's practice spans many genres from photography to video to installation and of course his use of the archive. Hello Robert.
Hello Boon Hui.
Let's talk about what are you doing right now, because here we are speaking, in your studio, which also doubles up as an exhibition space, and there's actually a project going on right now.
So we are in my studio now, and behind us is a work that I've been busy with during the pandemic, during circuit breaker in Singapore. Like many Singaporeans, I found myself trapped, and with the only thing that I could do was to mainly start to observe my surroundings. And this is actually a view from my window. I find myself looking at a secondary forest just outside my window. There's also an island when you exit the highway, and it's just a little small island. So what happened one day was I saw a wild boar came into this little island. So it's just a little tiny dog moving in the forest. But because it kept moving in circles, and then I realized something is wrong, because I see them just running across and that's it.
Yes.
But this one kept on repeating itself, and then I realized it's actually building a nest. And then, then it was building at a specific spot in the forest that didn't have a canopy. So I could see it from my apartment from 26 floors up. And then I got very excited because I felt, wow, this must be something quite rare. And so I looked at her for a period of about 10 days. So she built a nest, and then the babies came out on the 5th or 6th day. And so this is the long sequence that's running on the top. There's 2 layers now. The top layer is a sequence of 10 days where the wild boar is coming out. And then just about another 100 meters further down from my window, at the same time, they started to clear a forest. Naturalists have said that in Singapore, human wild boar conflict often happens when the wild boar's original habitat is being destroyed or being cleared out to build housing, so they have nowhere to go, and then they venture into our housing areas. And so I was thinking, was it the clearing of this forest that caused the wild boar to come over to this highway island to give birth? At the same time, I could study how the behavior of the boar is like, giving birth. At the same time, you could see why it's happening. We are clearing forests. Both are making growth. In fact, they're building a new bus depot, which we need because we are getting more public transport. And at the same time, the boar is just giving birth in whatever circumstances that it can find herself in. I kind of pair them up. The lower one showing in 10 days, the same time when the wild boar is giving birth, maybe her former home is being cleared. And then I titled them New Worlds. And because of the pandemic, I was forced to look closely at the landscape. I started taking a lot more videos. So that I did video work last year as well. Also happened to video some birds that happened to fly through the window, and it was really a coincidence because it was just thousands of birds. Thousands of open-bill stocks from Thailand came over, was outside the window, never happened before, and they were flying because of most likely a drought. They were looking for a new home, happened to just cluster around outside my window that afternoon. Couldn't quite understand what was happening. My friend said, "Hey Robert, there's storks flying outside our window." And then I thought, those white egrets flying is quite common. No, it's really a lot. All of us were just looking outside. Don't know what to make of it, because it was just like horror movie. Like crows are starting to fly everywhere.
Like the starlings.
They're slamming against the window, and so I just called my friend who is a scientist and said, "Hey, Tingy, there's a lot of these large birds flying outside my window. What's happening?" And it was as if I was talking to a kind of shaman that has the ability and knowledge to understand, this is what is happening, to interpret for me, because I cannot interpret. I'm at the loss of what this scene is telling me. So immediately he said these are open-bill stocks, because I know my friends in Malaysia has been telling me they've been seeing them in the past week. So we are slowly making their way down, and Singapore happened to be, they happen to congregate in thousands. They are trying to rest outside your house in this field. A drought that's happening in Thailand, due to whatever reason, is physically manifesting itself as a kind of bizarre flight in front of my
But
window.
that's fascinating because
Yeah.
this most recent work is also you're connecting also to concepts and concerns about the Anthropocene that is going on in a lot of contemporary artistic production and discourse right now. But I'm fascinated by the fact that even after so many years, your focus on nature, but nature not as a pristine, timeless nature that exists outside human society. Your view of nature has man and humanity inside, and this idea that somehow the presence of man in nature, even though man or woman is as you say part of that nature somehow changes it, even if they exist in separate worlds. At some level they exist on the same world and they interact. Talk about your practice. I mean, when I first saw your work, and I distinctly have a very clear impression, it was at the substation, when was it first solo?
Yeah.
If a Tree Falls, and I was introduced to the show as, there's this young photographer, and I was very confused at first. I said, but it doesn't look like a photography show. I was reminded, those of us who study art, we know that when photography first appeared, it was supposed to be like the killer of painting because it could capture objective reality, the world as it is, better than any painter could. But when I saw that show, which incidentally did not really have your name, it was about a research institute called the Institute of Critical Zoology. And after a while, I realized that, it was not about photographic depictions of nature or even archival depictions of nature, but it was about how these genres that we see in art, that artists use, photography, the use of the archive is constructing, you're using it to construct a world. And even the supposed author or researcher of that show, this Institute of Critical Zoology, is like an avatar. How did that sort of come together?
Yeah, my first show at the substation, I just graduated from Canberra College of Arts. I was a fresh grad. I came back, and the idea of the Institute of Critical Zoologists is actually pretty much a space for me to explore all the things that I'm interested in, which can be quite varied, can be quite confusing sometimes. Selfishly, I use my art practice to figure out more about how my mind works, to map and connect things together. And I was fortunate enough, I had a lecturer called Paul Taps in Camberwell who managed to ask me, you are kind of depicting nature, but at the same time I realized you like to create narratives, natural stories. You have this tendency to tell stories based on all the articles, all the research you read. Why don't you just combine them together? Instead of depicting, you create everything, the images, the context and everything, into the kind of world that you see, you want to bring your audience in. And I thought about it, oh yeah, so actually my schoolwork and my personal work has always been living separate lives. So at that point in time, I tried to marry them. I don't know how, but I just created the website Institute of Critical Zoologists, start to plunk my project inside, and try to imagine, okay, because all the articles I read are from so and so very famous institution, it's almost always nature is talked about by Smithsonian, National Geographic, they are the authorities. So as an artist, I felt, I need to be on that level to carry out something like that, so that you will pay attention to me. So I copy their language, I copy their diagrams. It's like a photograph. I document it and I reappropriate it into some of the narratives I talk about. So different projects talk about different things I notice that are sometimes funny, sometimes disturbing, sometimes I feel we should question. And then the most importantly is the story. And then of course the visual element, which is the photograph or the installation, and then the project is created. So there's always a lot of research, a lot of wondering on my part, and then the image taking is almost always the last part of it.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think in a lot of your expositions, but particularly your solos, I realized that the text is very important, and it always has a particular kind of tone, the word you use, the authority of scientific writing and scientific research, to sometimes terrify, sometimes intrigue, and sometimes the text is not there to explain the imagery. The text is like an artistic production in itself, you know. So it's interesting to hear you say that actually in terms of process, the imagery came last.
For me, a lot of science articles, actually they are quite bizarre, what scientists have discovered, and the images sometimes lend it to become more absurd. And I kind of like to play with that relationship in the work, the text and the image. The tone of the language is very much of science, very objective. And I've always been...
Yet it's not.
Yet it's not.
It's actually, a lot of it is actually very emotional, but I think what's really fascinating is you seem to seize upon what most of us who are not, you know, specialists in science, you know, that we ascribe a certain kind of believability to scientific writing, because this type of writing is written is to actually suppress a lot of emotion, because you must be objective.
It's only lately that I realized that that maybe objectivity, like you said, that science comes with, doesn't actually bring us closer or make our connections with nature more obvious. In fact, objectivity gives us a good distance. It makes us like, you know, now we understand you, we can dissect you, we can take the lithium.
I mean, that's science, right?
Yeah, that's science.
That you must taxonomize and put things into compartments.
The strange thing is, when you fully understand something, it doesn't actually mean that you will like it or you appreciate it more. In fact, the thing about Western science and objectivity, I realized it lets you have lesser emotional connection, because now that you understand it as an object, it can be controlled and conquered. With every project, I'm realizing a bit more about why I was concerned with it in the past, you know, and then I build on it. And you also talk about collecting archival materials, taking photographs of the past, which I wish I was there, or trying to understand what all these people, you know, all these photographs meant. For me, they are a montage of the image I'm creating today. It needs to be seen with the images I create today, you know, to get a kind of a fuller, wider lens, I would say, to what's happening around.
Well, in a sense, nowadays it's very fashionable to talk of artists being multi-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, and they do this. But I think when you cross across disciplines like into science or history, you are actually interrogating the worlds that they create and the kind of illusions or presuppositions we must have in order to understand what those researchers or that line of inquiry is trying to get at. You must accept the claim of objectivity, right, or believability. So I want to talk about, I mean, the next project that I saw extensively was the Land Archive. It was very clearly rooted like in Singapore and so on. And again, you produce this thing called the Land Archive, you know, which of course if you go and Google, like you know, doesn't really exist. But you know, there you begin to see more obviously also the possibility that really this is about a place in Singapore. What was the genesis of that?
The Land Archive was formed after the Institute of Critical Zoologists, and it formed mainly because I was starting to spend more time in Singapore. And I was starting to also think about what has Singapore got to do in the way that I think about my work, about nature. It does, of course, because Singapore is, you know, the city in the garden, nature in the city.
It's a man-made city.
Yeah, it's a
man-made nature, right? It's
so green, so tropical. So that has a kind of subconscious effect on the way that I think of nature, and we are so much in control. Like the bonsai analogy of it's really our city is presented for maximum use for humans. Also looking at old images of Singapore, true, we have been, you know, paving our mountains since 1800s, you know, reclaiming land. It's almost unrecognizable what we see today from 1800s. It's not a short process. It's been 200 years of reclaiming land.
It's 20%, right?
Yeah, 20.
Yeah, it's a lot for any country in the world.
And it's still happening.
Yes.
It's not as if we have stopped. We have never stopped for the last 100 years, and we don't see it. It's not in our visual archive. My father used to bring me to Tuas, and this is now where there's the Asia Pacific breweries and all the factories. Before that, when they started to reclaim, they have to let it settle for 5 years. And the funny thing was, people could go in. right?
Yes.
And people with their jeeps are going in, people with their remote control aircraft are going there, people who are fishing are going there, and my father was going there to fish, and I would drive and walk there, and it's like just this insanely beautiful. And at that time I was very young, I was like 12.
What decade was this?
This was in the...
I'm not trying to guess your age. I know your age already. But...
This was in when I was in, it should be in the 90s. I started my poly diploma with a major in photography. All my projects was done in the reclaimed land.
Really?
Yeah, because it was such a beautiful space. And it's like a blank canvas.
Yeah.
I just need to ask my fashion model to stand there, it's beautiful. I put a toy animal there, it's surreal. And at the same time, my scientist friend, the same friend I called to describe the open view stop, we went there to watch birds. So I took some photos there for my assignment, then I went to UK. Then when I came back, I realized, oh, actually I should do something about that space. It's such a beautiful space. Then I started to understand, actually it's kind of, it's environmentally problematic to be doing that on such a large scale. It affects the oceans and things like that. But for me, looking through the archives and looking through at how this is an important part of our history, I realized we don't have my kind of version of a strange, surreal moment I have in the landscape with the other people who are fishing there, who are cycling there. So I started to look for similar landscapes like this. And I think it was during a visit to the Tottori Desert in Japan.
Wow.
It's visited by 10,000 domestic tourists in Japan daily.
Oh, really?
They will just walk in the sand to the sea and then come back. So I just took pictures of the Tottori Desert and then have one or two of the twice ones, and then I jumbled them up together and said like, this was, images of land reclamation of people kind of exploring them, trying to reach the beach that was once there. So nothing too kind of descriptive, just a slice of that moment in history. A photograph I felt that we didn't have, or I didn't have. It's still happening right now as we are speaking, right? But it's just that there's no accessibility. And it's a huge landscape, right? It's something that we lack.
I remembered, all these images exactly like you described. It's very strange just having that kind of landscape, to just have a group of people walking there. It looks very surreal, but yet very real. And it's really, suddenly there's a sense of place that you want this to be a real place.
Yeah.
That project was very fascinating because you got the sense that you were catching, something at a particular moment that after that it passes and you will never get it back. Your projects after that, particularly the Flora and Fauna, the critical dictionary, I think it's picking up from what you said earlier about how science, categorizes. What gave you the idea to embark on that?
A guide to the flora and fauna of the world was commissioned by the Singapore Biennale back in 2013. So at that point of time, I already made several small books. I realized with the materials that I'm going to embark on the project is quite a lot. So I started talking with a designer to see how we can explore, and then he felt like, let's make this an encyclopedia. Because the way you're talking about it seems like an encyclopedia.
You actually collected some of those objects that we see in the photograph, right?
There was a computer chip that was meant to remotely control cockroaches.
Yeah.
I got it from the internet from this guy. He even editioned it for me because he was very excited. Someone from Singapore bought this invention from him. There were several starting points to the project. One was that I realized I have a lot of stories that I do not have images of. I read about and like, what does this look like? How do we visualize a story as bizarre as what is the scientific name of the goldfish?
Yes.
There isn't one, and it didn't have a Latin name because it's not a natural fish.
Yeah.
And it's so unnatural that we do not know how it became the way it is today.
Yeah.
Nobody knows. That's amazing because our history is quite short.
Yeah.
And yet the history of this fish is lost. We don't really know how it became the few hundred different forms that we have today. And it has reached a point where in China they are holding goldfish queens competition, and the judging criteria is as met as how calm it is when you hold it on your hand out of the water. So I just try to capture in the historical moment of 2013 what all those moments were, or what it looked like and what the story was. A lot of the things that felt bizarre in 2013 is already quite normal. A lot of things are were scientific papers and proposals are already happening 9 years later. So how our relationship with nature is changing is so fast with the technology and science. These things will not be found in an encyclopedia.
Yeah.
Because they have no kind of a proper category. They are like the orphans, the
Yeah.
orphans. I felt like, let's create a space for these things to go. So maybe the Institute of Critical Zoologists is such a space for things that are forgotten by science but a product of science, so that I'm like trying to catch all they left behind.
But it's interesting, this is when also you very obviously you use publication and the idea of an art book as the integral part of the project, right? And of course the book was very successful. It won an award. So are you continuing to develop ideas for art books as a kind of expressive outlet?
Art book making is something that is closely tied to my practice. It's something that I picked up when I was studying in the United Kingdom. A lot of photographers like to do photo books.
Yeah.
And because, as you would have noticed by now, a lot of my work is about storytelling.
Yeah.
About the observations and the text.
Yeah.
And the book form allows me to direct your experience of the text and the image as I want it. And it's a solo experience, so I have your attention.
Yeah.
The books that I'm working on now, it's called the New Forest series, and it's really a montage of historical photographs of Singapore, of nature, and how it might relate to our landscape today. Okay, so kind of trying to help you understand the things we see today is not so disconnected from the things that we have done in the past.
It's a memory.
Yes, the residual memory of our acts, our plantation growing, our deforestation, the wars, our colonial history, is all present in the landscape if we have the right lens to kind of tune into it. So I think the book kind of tries to add that perspective into this kind of looking at nature in Singapore.
What your practice is doing now is also the artist as a kind of connector of various kinds of ideas that sometimes they're floating out there, sometimes they're ignored, sometimes they are not. But I think what you bring is also when they are connected, then something else, new meaning comes, because you have certain conjunction of disparate things, So I think the book, it seems to be a kind of logical, successor and another development in your this kind of connecting practice.
This is only something I realized like in the last 3 years, that is really, I think, how as an artist, what I can bring to this table of science and nature, it is all those connections that more as established disciplines are unable to kind of forge and connect. And hopefully with more connections and sensitivities, the audience can be able to look at nature a bit more informed, more wider, more open, receptacle to different senses and thinking.
Suddenly I'm reminded of, like with the Minor series, I remembered being told you literally were hiding in the trees. Immediately I thought that's exactly like what happens in the David Attenborough nature documentary. It is the practice of nature photographers, right? So it's fascinating that as an artist who uses also a lot of digital manipulation in your images, at the same time you also have this practice that is, in a sense, very much part of what we call nature photography, this kind of patience and waiting for nature, for that moment in nature.
A lot of times I find myself being a nature photographer, and most of the time nothing happens. Just
like this, you're waiting for 10 days before the ball actually does.
How I kind of counter that with this waiting is, of course, I go out quite often into the forest. But I also use camera traps, not animal traps. I place them in the forest and trees, sometimes up to 20, and then they will just faithfully record nature. So whenever there's a movement, rain, a leaf, an insect, a moth. But even so, after going through 1 year of footage, it is indeed very boring. Without a David Attenborough voice telling you what's happening, you are at a loss to how to interpret all these hundreds of minutes of animal movement, birds feeding or God knows what's happening. I find myself at a loss, unable to interpret. So in a lot of my video work in the last 2-3 years, it has been trying to kind of work with, I would say, all these cameras that are in the forest.
But that's fascinating because that is also a very established technique in nature photography.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Trigger, motion triggers.
Motion triggers.
So moving ahead, let's say in the next year, hopefully we come out of the pandemic. What are your plans?
Trying to experiment with the video form. Most of my time I spend working on videos and trying to visit things that I've done with photography, with video. Yeah, so a lot of experimenting, learning to work with people.
That's a very interesting phrase, learning to work with people.
Because I've never ever had to.
Yes.
It was always just me and my camera.
Yes.
And that's it. But then now I realize I have maybe a camera operator, a sound person, an editor. It's like growing new limbs. And you have to get used to these limbs.
But what a great kind of metaphor for post-pandemic art making. Your current practice, with this space, I think also it's interesting. You are also, in a sense, facilitating other artists' work. I mean, what made you move to this point?
I share the studio with Song. Song he's my neighbor and good friend, also a visual artist. And we decided when we moved here that it was just natural that we should have carved our exhibition space to allow other artists to come, and we haven't quite settled on what kind of work will be shown here, but we do know that we want to kind of show young artists here, and hopefully just kind of work with them, and if this space could be of use to them as how it was useful for me to have a space at Substation, then it would be great. And Song runs the book show, which is just opposite us. The book show is also a space of experimentation and promotion for artists who like to do books, and he's also beginning to publish young artist books. And then of course we have that room where we do our installation, our production. That's at the back, but most of the space is meant to see and kind of show other art.
So yeah, we look forward to your new projects. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Boon Hui.
Yeah.